which really the essence of the species is transforming over time. So let me illustrate this. Imagine a biologist would come across this pattern in nature where they're seeing different generations of a species of moth, and they notice that from generation to generation the moths on average are getting darker in color. So a variationist would look at this and explain it in terms of mutation and selection. So not all organisms survive and reproduce, only some do, and so that's denoted here with the circles. They're the reproducing moths, and the arrows denote their offspring. The offspring will resemble the parents, but not perfectly, and if any offspring are born with an adaptation that happens to be favorable to them, right, a trait that happens to be favorable in their current environment, that organism will be more likely to survive and reproduce. I hope that's familiar with all of you. A transformationist would look at the same pattern of results, so they explain it in a very different way. Basically, they would ignore the variation that's going on within a generation, within a population, and just think about the population as a whole. What's the essence of the population, and how is that changing over time? So if you try to take an average here, the moths are gradually getting darker in color, and so the question is, what's driving that change? The change that's sort of working at the level of the essence as opposed to the level of the individual moths. So I'm going into this because it turns out that a lot of adults hold transformationist misconceptions. But before I get there, I want to try to explain why that is the case. And again, going back to development. So another historian of biology, Stephen Jay Gould, has also talked about this problem, like the evolution of evolution, theories of evolution, and how hard it is to understand evolution. And he points to essentialism as the problem. So this is what he has to say about essentialism. Our Platonic heritage prompts us to view means and medians as the hard realities, and the variation that permits their calculation as a set of transient and imperfect measurements of this hidden essence. But all evolutionary biologists know that variation itself is nature's only irreducible essence. Variation is the hard reality, not a set of imperfect measures for a central tendency. Means and medians are the abstractions. So basically what Gould is saying is that since Plato's time, we've been focusing on the essence of a species, not the variation. And the variation is actually where all the action is. But you don't have to go to Plato to find evidence of essentialism. It's not the case that Plato introduced this idea into culture and just continued after him. It turns out that you can see essentialism from in the thought of very young children like 2 or 3 years of age. And essentialism is sort of our basic default way of understanding the biological world. You see an animal and it has fangs and claws, and you wonder, what is that animal? Or why does that animal have those properties? And a perfectly reasonable explanation is because it's a tiger. And the tiger is sort of the name of its essence. That's the explanation for why it has those properties. And why is this animal a tiger? Well, because its parents were tigers, and if it had babies, its babies would be tigers. There's this idea that essences are conferred at birth, and they determine an organism's subsequent development, its behavior, and its appearance. So you can see evidence of essentialist thought in kids' reasoning with some cleverly crafted experiments. You can't just ask them, are you an essentialist? But in one set of experiments, what they would do is they would show children animals that they're familiar with and teach them a novel property. So say, here's a cat. Did you know that cats can see in the dark? Which of these other animals do you think can also see in the dark? And what kids do is basically they extend that property to anything that's labeled a cat, even if it doesn't look like a cat. So if you label a skunk a cat, they will tell you it can see in the dark. And if you take a picture of a cat but label it as something else, they won't extend the property. They'll deny that it can see in the dark. So they really care about essences. And here it's the proxy for that is the label. In a slightly more complicated experiment, you can present 3-year-olds with a sort of switched at birth experiment where you tell them, here are some cows and here's their baby. We're going to take the baby away and give it to these pigs, and the pigs are going to raise it. When this animal grows up, what kind of properties is it going to have? Is it going to have a straight tail like a cow or a curly tail like a pig? Is it going to eat grass like a cow or eat slop like a pig? And even 3-year-olds will claim that it's the biological parents that determine the organism's traits, not the adopted parents. Again, it's early stirrings of essentialism. So the specific research I wanted to talk to you about right now is there are really two questions that underlie the research. The first was, to what extent did individuals of different ages recognize that members of a species vary in their traits? Essentialism is a great cognitive tool for thinking about, for predicting the properties of individual organisms, but it's potentially problematic in thinking about variation, as Gould, in the ways that Gould said, if you focus on the essence, you forget about variation. So that's one question. And another question was, is recognition that species vary in their traits correlated with a correct understanding of evolution? All right. So in this particular study, there were 43 kids aged 4 to 9 and 34 adults from the general community, not just college students. And what the task was is that they were presented with various animal exemplars, some of them mammals, some of them insects, and they were asked to judge the variability of 3 types of their properties. Internal anatomical properties, external anatomical properties, and behavioral properties. And the adult participants completed an assessment of their understanding of evolution. We didn't adapt it to children because we assumed that they would hold misconceptions. But for the adults, the question was, does their understanding correlate with their acceptance of within-species variation? So here are some of the properties. Giraffes was one of our animal exemplars, and the behavioral property was sleeping on their feet, external property having spots on their toes, internal property having an extra neck joint. Ants was one of our insect exemplars. The behavioral property is living in mounds of dirt, external property having feelers on their head, internal property having a tube-shaped heart. And all these things, these properties were true of the animals because we didn't want kids to come away with the wrong ideas. So everybody saw a picture of the animal, just a single individual, and they were first asked, do you know that this animal has this trait? So do you know that pandas have thumbs on their forepaws? And children almost always claimed that they did know these things, even when they were genuinely novel properties to them. And then we explained why they have them, we gave them some function information. They use the forepaws to hold bamboo. Do you think all pandas have thumbs or just most pandas? So here's our question about actual variability. Do you think that that in the population that actually exists, there's some variability? If they claim that no, there is no variability, all pandas have thumbs, then we ask the question about potential variability. Could a panda be born with a different kind of forepaw? And we didn't just say, could it be born without a thumb, because we didn't want them to think, we just think about detrimental mutations. We're just talking about difference. And if they still claim that that variation is not possible, we ask for justification. So for the adults, they did that task, and then they also did a task that assessed their understanding of evolution. And this came from earlier work that I had done that was specific just with adults, not really focused on the developmental piece of it. And the adults' responses to this test were coded in accordance with variationism and transformationism, as I put up earlier. So responses to the test that were consistent with variational responses, those were the correct responses, those got +1 points. The incorrect transformational responses, -1 points, and the ambiguous responses, 0 points. So there was a total range of -3 to +3. All right, so here's a sample question from the adults' assessment. Imagine that biologists discover a new species of woodpecker that lives in isolation on a secluded island. These woodpeckers have, on average, a 1-inch beak, and their only food source is a tree-dwelling insect that lives, on average, 1.5 inches under the tree bark. Compared to its parents, the offspring of any 2 woodpeckers should develop A, a longer beak, B, a shorter beak, C, either a longer beak or a shorter beak, neither is more likely. So you can think about what answer you would choose. I'm not going to ask you to tell me by a show of hands. The transformational lure here, the incorrect response is A, because that's the response that assumes that all offspring are going to be more adapted to previous studies. Does God do these things? Dream, see, talk, think. Those are the psychological properties. Eat, grow, sleep, sneeze, biological properties. Get cold, get wet, move, stretch, physical properties. And finally, how confident are you that God exists? So what I'll show you now is similar to what I showed you previously. I'm going to take each belief and show you the percent of the sample that endorse that belief, and then also the correlation between endorsing that belief and the number of properties you attributed to God in the property attribution part. So I'm taking the property attribution task as sort of the main measure of your God concept, and looking at how that relates to